The duel is never won at the moment of the strike. It is won in the silence before. Picture this. A glass-walled conference room on the 31st floor of a tower in Tokyo. The kind of room where you can feel the stakes in the air before anyone has said anything at all. Ryo has been sitting here for 22 minutes. His presentation deck is printed. His notes are color-coded, and he rehearsed his opening in the mirror that morning, every counter-argument mapped out, every pivot pre-planned. He spent months preparing for this meeting, a merger deal worth $50 million. The other side is late. And not accidentally. Ryo knows this, but knowing it doesn't stop what's quietly happening inside him. The slow cortisol drip, the erosion of the composure he'd carefully built that morning. His jaw has tightened. The color-coded notes in front of him suddenly feel irrelevant, because the room is no longer the room he arrived in. It's been converted, without a single word spoken, into enemy territory. When they finally walk in, 3 of them, no apology, no acknowledgement of the time. Their lead negotiator doesn't look at Ryo first. He looks out the window, points something out to his colleague, shares a private laugh. Then, as Ryo opens his mouth to begin, the man holds up one finger, not rudely, just calmly, as if he has all the time in the world, as if this entire room, including the man sitting across it who prepared for months, simply isn't urgent. The negotiation hasn't started, and Ryo can feel, viscerally, physically feel, that something has already shifted against him. You know this feeling, that nauseating awareness that your opponent isn't just prepared with better arguments. They're operating from an entirely different layer of the game, one that exists beneath the surface of what's said, somewhere in the architecture of the room itself and the silence within it. That feeling has a name, and it has a solution. The solution comes from a man who lived 400 years ago, who fought 61 duels and never once lost, and who understood something so fundamental about conflict that it applies just as cleanly to a boardroom as to a beach at dawn. His name was Miyamoto Musashi, and what he knew about dismantling an opponent's mind before the encounter even begins is the most underused psychological edge available to anyone who negotiates for a living. Victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win. Let's start with what we already know works. The past few decades have produced genuinely excellent negotiation science. Chris Voss and the Tactical Empathy Framework, calibrated questions, mirroring, the late-night FM voice, these are sophisticated tools built on real behavioral psychology. The Harvard Negotiation Project gave us principled negotiation, the concept of BATNA, the focus on separating people from positions. These frameworks have made countless negotiators sharper, more strategic, and far more effective than they'd otherwise be. Here's the thing, though. None of them will help you if you walk into the room already psychologically compromised. Ryo had read all of it. He understood the theory deeply. But by the time his counterpart finally sat down, Ryo's prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for strategic thinking, for reading the room, for executing those sophisticated frameworks, was running at well below capacity. Because 22 minutes of anxious waiting had flooded his system with stress hormones. The tools were there, the cognitive equipment to use them, had already been quietly degraded. This is the missing layer that almost nobody talks about. The frameworks teach you what to do once the conversation begins, but they assume a baseline of internal stability that most people, in genuinely high-stakes situations, simply do not have when they need it most. Think about what actually determines your state when you walk into a difficult negotiation. It's not your preparation notes, it's whether you feel in your gut that you can afford to lose this deal. It's whether the silence from the other side feels like information or like threat. It's whether your identity as a professional is wrapped up in this outcome, or whether you can engage with genuine detachment. These are not tactical questions, they are psychological ones, and they exist at a deeper level than any framework addresses. What Musashi understood, and this is the insight that cuts across 4 centuries, is that the most dangerous opponent in any conflict is not the person across from you. It's the state of your own nervous system. An anxious mind reveals it speaks too soon, concedes too early, and fills silences that should have been left to expand. A calm mind, by contrast, gathers information simply by staying quiet and projects a quality of composure that makes even skilled opponents recalibrate. Musashi built this internal mastery as the foundation of everything else. It's what made his tactical genius actually deployable, and his method breaks down into 4 specific weapons, each of which maps onto modern negotiation with remarkable precision. It begins, of all places, with a drifting boat. There's a Taoist parable Musashi would have known well. Imagine you're crossing a river in a small boat and another vessel collides with yours. You feel the impact, feel the irritation rising, someone's carelessness, someone's aggression. Then you look, and the boat is empty. No one's there, just a vessel caught by the current. The anger dissolves instantly. You cannot rage at emptiness. Musashi made the empty boat his strategic identity. No visible ego, no visible need, no legible attachment to how this particular encounter resolved. An empty boat cannot be provoked, cannot be baited, cannot be read. It simply moves, governed by forces more fundamental than emotion. This wasn't a philosophy for him, it was a tactical posture, and he built it through 4 concrete practices. Weapon 1, the temporal ambush. Sen no sen, seizing the initiative through time. April 13th, 1612. Ganryū Island, off the western coast of Japan. Sasaki Kojiro has been standing on the beach for 3 hours. He is, by most accounts, the greatest technical swordsman of his era, master of the nodachi, a blade so long it required its own scabbard technique to draw. His signature strike, the swallow cut, was documented to move faster than the eye could track. He had never lost a duel in his life. He arrived that morning at peak readiness, flanked by officials and disciples, carrying the absolute confidence of a man who had never been seriously questioned. And then he waited. Think carefully about what 3 hours of anticipatory waiting does to a human mind. The adrenaline response, which was perfectly calibrated at dawn, sharp, focused, primed, has spiked and crashed at least twice over. The internal rehearsal that a sharp mind runs before any high-stakes encounter. When he draws, I'll do this. When he feints left, I'll counter here, has looped so many times through the same scenarios that it stopped producing clarity and started producing noise. And underneath all of it, the ego that arrived with perfect confidence has had 3 full hours to quietly interrogate itself. Where is he? Is this contempt? Is this fear? Is this calculated? When Musashi finally arrived, not in armor, without ceremony, apparently relaxed, having spent the boat crossing sleeping and that morning carving his weapon from a spare oar, Kojiro erupted. He drew his sword and threw the scabbard into the sea in fury. Musashi looked at the scabbard floating away and said quietly, "You've already lost, Kojiro. A man who intends to survive doesn't throw away his sheath." The duel lasted 1 exchange, 30 seconds. Musashi's improvised wooden sword against the finest blade in Japan. Kojiro fell with a fractured skull. He didn't lose to Musashi's technique. He lost to 3 hours of his own imagination. By the time the actual encounter happened, he was fighting from inside a cloud of exhausted anticipation and barely controlled rage, while Musashi arrived rested, clear, and operating at full capacity. The modern translation of this is straightforward, but most people are reluctant to use it because it feels aggressive. Controlling the timing of a high-stakes encounter, arriving later than expected, allowing a silence to extend past comfort, refusing to rush, is not rudeness. It is environmental management. The person who waits accumulates cognitive and emotional cost. The person who controls when the encounter begins decides who pays that cost. But there's a subtler dimension that matters just as much. Musashi wrote in the Book of 5 Rings, "Really skillful people never get out of time and are always deliberate and never appear busy." The negotiator who moves with unhurried deliberateness, who doesn't check their phone mid-conversation or signal that they need this meeting to end by a certain time, communicates something powerful without speaking it, that their time is not scarce, and therefore that their need for this particular outcome is not acute. And in any negotiation with a party who needs the deal least, holds the strongest position. The most important thing in communication is hearing what isn't said. Peter Drucker. Weapon 2. Ma, the weaponized void. Silence as the most aggressive move available. There is a concept in Japanese aesthetics called ma. It translates imperfectly as negative space, but that undersells its weight. Ma is the silence between musical phrases that gives the notes around it meaning. The gap between calligraphy strokes that lets each one breathe. The pause before a decision that tells everyone in the room how much is at stake. In combat, Musashi used silence as an offensive instrument. Before engaging, he would stand completely still, his gaze in the state the samurai called Enzan no Metsuke, gazing at the distant mountain, present but unreachable, neither staring at his opponent nor looking away. The silence pressed on his opponent like physical weight, and they would move first, speak first, betray their rhythm first, because silence is psychologically unbearable to a person who needs to win. The reason is neurological. When a negotiation produces an uncomfortable pause, the brain's threat detection systems classify that silence as a potential rejection and generate urgent pressure to resolve it. For most people, that pressure overrides strategy. They speak not because speaking serves them, but because the silence became intolerable. The practical implication is one of the most consistently underused techniques in professional negotiation. After you make an offer, say nothing. Wait through the discomfort. Let the silence do the work. Research repeatedly shows that the first person to speak after an offer is made reveals significantly more about their actual flexibility than any formal disclosure could. They soften the number. They add concessions they never intended to offer. They explain their constraints in detail, trying to fill the void. Most negotiators intellectually know this and still can't execute it, because the training to tolerate silence under pressure is different from the knowledge that silence works. It requires conditioning, not information. Weapon 3. Coup, the unreadable self. Do not let the enemy see your spirit. Musashi called the fifth ring in his Book of Five Rings the void. For centuries, scholars debated what he meant by it, because that chapter contains almost no tactical instruction. It simply describes a state of being, no fixed form, no visible orientation, no attachment to a particular outcome, and therefore the capacity to move in any direction with equal speed. In practical terms, what this produced was an opponent who couldn't be read. An experienced swordsman or a senior negotiator doesn't primarily read your words or your arguments, they read you. The slight shift in breathing when a number close to your floor is mentioned. The micro-expression when they probe a position you're uncertain about. The almost invisible forward lean when something you want appears to be in reach. Your body broadcasts this information continuously, and skilled opponents receive it without you realizing the transmission is happening. Kojiro threw his scabbard because Musashi's demeanor communicated something that bypassed all rational processing, something like genuine indifference to the outcome of this specific encounter, not performed toughness, not manufactured calm, but the particular quality of a person who is simply not afraid of losing this. That quality is extraordinarily difficult to fake and extraordinarily destabilizing to face, because if your opponent genuinely doesn't need this, you have no idea where their flaw actually is. This is where most people's understanding of BATNA stops short. We're taught to construct a BATNA as a logical calculation. If this deal falls through, option B yields X. That calculation is valuable as far as it goes. But the deeper power of BATNA isn't mathematical, it's psychological. A well-constructed set of genuine alternatives doesn't just change your strategic options, it changes how you feel when you walk into the room. And that change in feeling changes everything the other party perceives from the first moment they look at you. Musashi's decode, written 9 days before his death, includes the precept, "Do not pursue the taste of good food." Not as a call to asceticism, as a reminder that craving for any specific outcome creates a readable vulnerability, and vulnerabilities in any serious negotiation get found and used. You must put yourself in the enemy's place and think from the enemy's point of view. Miyamoto Musashi, The Book of Five Rings. Weapon 4. The Mirror Strike. To become the enemy, see yourself as the enemy of the enemy. Before every significant duel, Musashi conducted what we might now call a psychological profile of his opponent, not their technique, but their psychology, their relationship with their own reputation, what a loss would mean to them specifically, what kind of victory would satisfy them beyond the mere outcome. For Kojiro, Musashi understood that the man's identity was built entirely on his reputation for speed and technical perfection. The legend of the swallow cut wasn't just a fighting style, it was Kojiro's self. So Musashi didn't compete on speed. He made Kojiro wait, which forced Kojiro into his own head, running his signature sequences on an imaginary opponent for 3 hours and burning the cognitive fuel he needed for the real encounter. The modern negotiation application is this: the most important preparation you can do for a significant negotiation isn't sharpening your position. It's understanding your counterpart's emotional stakes. Not their corporate position, their personal investment in this outcome. Some people need to feel they've been seen as shrewd. Others need to be able to tell their team they protected them. Some need a visible win they can report upward, even if the actual deal terms are less favorable than they appear. Once you understand what your counterpart emotionally needs from this encounter, you stop competing for deal points and start engineering their experience of the negotiation itself. Give them the things that cost you little, but satisfy that psychological need. Protect the things that actually matter. Musashi wrote, "The important thing in strategy is to suppress the enemy's useful actions, but allow his useless actions. Their useless actions are the ones that make them feel good without changing the real terrain of the deal. Allow those freely. The real terrain is yours." Fall 7 times, stand up 8. Japanese proverb. Part 3. The application. Ryo rebuilds. Ryo didn't lose that first deal, he lost the 3 after it the same way. Better preparation each time. Worse outcome. More data, more color-coded notes, more rigorous logic, and still something upstream of all that was defeating him before he opened his mouth. After the 3rd, he stopped buying new negotiation books and started sitting with a single old one. The Book of 5 Rings, a used copy, spine cracked, margins annotated by some previous reader who'd clearly argued with it. Next to Musashi's line, "The important thing in strategy is to suppress the enemy's useful actions." Someone had written simply, "Before the meeting starts." Ryo spent a year building what Musashi had built over a lifetime. Not the tactical moves, but the internal foundation those moves require. He trained his nervous system to tolerate discomfort by deliberately engineering it in low-stakes contexts, sitting in silence for extended periods, arriving intentionally late to his own internal check-ins, holding positions in minor negotiations well past the point of comfort. This sounds almost absurdly simple, which is why almost no one does it. The anxiety that degrades performance in high-stakes rooms doesn't respond to intellectual reassurance. It responds to accumulated evidence that discomfort is survivable and ultimately informative. He rebuilt his alternatives, not as a BATNA calculation on a spreadsheet, but as genuinely developed relationships and parallel opportunities, things he'd have been genuinely fine pursuing if any single deal evaporated. The difference between knowing you have a backup and feeling the security of real options is the difference between a concept and an internal state. Only the internal state changes how you appear. He began preparing psychologically rather than only tactically. Before significant meetings, he researched the person across the table, not their professional history, but their behavioral patterns. Where had they given ground before, and under what emotional conditions? What did they need to feel good about an outcome? What was the narrative they'd tell their organization afterward if the deal went their way? And he practiced silence, deliberately, systematically, until it stopped feeling like failure and started feeling like control. Today is victory over yourself of yesterday. Tomorrow is your victory over lesser men. Miyamoto Musashi, The Book of Five Rings. Part 4. The Transformation. The Room. 3 years later. Different conference room, different city, larger deal, bigger enough that 40 people's employment depended on Ryo closing it. He arrived 8 minutes late, not by accident, but by design. Having spent the morning walking slowly, reading, eating without rushing. No performance of urgency, because he had generated none internally. The other party was already seated. Their lead negotiator was a man with a specific reputation in the industry for psychological dominance in high-value deals. He looked up when Ryo entered, and something briefly crossed his face. Not irritation, but something closer to recalibration. Because Ryo didn't apologize for the time, he settled into his chair with complete unhurriedness, poured himself water from the carafe on the table as though he were in his own office, and said, "Thank you for making time." The framing was quiet and total, not "I know you've been waiting," not "sorry for the delay," just "thank you for making time." An implicit statement that both parties' time carried equal weight, and that everyone in this room was here because they chose to be. When the other side made their opening offer, Ryo let 38 seconds of silence hold the room. 3 of the 5 people across the table shifted in their seats. Then he said, "Tell me why you landed there." Not a counter, a question, open, unhurried, almost academic in its tone, an invitation for them to explain their own number, which meant explaining their reasoning, which meant revealing the constraints inside it. They talked for 6 minutes while Ryo listened with the patience of someone who understood that information volunteered under the pressure of silence is almost always more accurate than information exchanged in rapid back and forth. By the time he responded, he knew more about their real position than most negotiators surface in a full session of formal exchange. The deal closed over 4 meetings. The terms were substantially better than the opening suggested was achievable. Afterward, the other party's lead, in the candid moment that sometimes follows the conclusion of a difficult negotiation, asked where Ryo had learned to negotiate the way he did. Ryo considered the question. "Feudal Japan," he said. The man laughed. Ryo wasn't entirely joking. "Think lightly of yourself and deeply of the world." Miyamoto Musashi. Part 5. The Universal Truth. What Ganryū Island was actually about. Here is what most people miss when they study what happened on that beach. Musashi's lateness is remembered as a psychological tactic, a power move, a calculated manipulation. But that framing misunderstands something essential. Musashi arrived late because he was genuinely indifferent to the ceremony of the occasion. He carved his weapon from an oar not as theatre, but because he was the kind of man who used whatever was present rather than waiting for ideal conditions. He slept on the crossing, not to project calm, but because he had trained himself to such a degree that this particular duel simply didn't have the power to steal his sleep. The psychological effect on Kojiro was real and decisive. but it wasn't manufactured. It was the natural expression of a man who had spent years building an internal state that required nothing from any specific external outcome to remain intact. This is the distinction that matters. Performed confidence is visible at close range to anyone who's developed their own internal calibration. It has a particular quality of effort about it, a slight tension between what's projected and what's felt. Genuine equanimity, the real thing, built through years of deliberately choosing difficult positions and surviving them, has no such tension. It radiates as a kind of spaciousness, an absence of urgency that the room around it feels. Musashi wrote, "There is nothing outside of yourself that can ever enable you to get better, stronger, richer, quicker, or smarter. Everything is within, everything exists. Seek nothing outside of yourself." This line gets quoted as inspiration. It is actually a precision description of where negotiation leverage comes from. The negotiator who needs this deal to feel successful has already ceded leverage they may never recover. The one who walks in with no such need because they've built genuine alternatives, trained their nervous system, and cleared their identity away from this particular outcome is operating from a fundamentally different position. The external frameworks, the tactical tools, the calibrated questions and the silence techniques, they all become dramatically more powerful when the person executing them is not silently fighting their own anxiety at the same time. This is what Musashi understood and what most negotiation training skips. Internal mastery is not the soft, philosophical prerequisite to tactical skill. It is the tactical skill. Everything else is built on top of it, and without it, the best frameworks in the world are tools held by hands that are quietly shaking. Every significant negotiation you walk into carries this same fundamental architecture. There's the visible layer, offers, counter-offers, concessions, terms, and beneath it, there's the psychological layer, where the actual outcome is usually decided before either party makes their first move. Most people spend all their preparation on the visible layer. Musashi spent his preparation on what was underneath. Build the alternatives that give you genuine detachment. Train your nervous system to treat silence as an ally. Study your counterpart's psychology with more rigor than you study their position. And then walk into the room with a particular quality of presence that comes not from confidence in a good outcome, but from indifference to a bad one. That quality is undefeatable, not because it wins every encounter, because it cannot be exploited by the ones it doesn't win. Build it slowly. It takes longer than any framework. It lasts longer too. Think lightly of yourself and deeply of the world. Miyamoto Musashi, Decode, 1645. The Book of Five Rings is not a book about swords. It never was.